Welcome to everybody. This is our seminar series for the year, where what were we thinking is the topic of conversation. At each seminar, we try and then break it down into something relevant. Grant and I have been chatting over a period of time in terms of the city, and his focus is particularly in Nelson Mandela Bay very often in terms of the work that he does. Grant's I think a developmental economist, if there's a box to put him in, but likes to go behind the scenes in terms of understanding how systems work and how things all work together, and how often unintended consequences arise out of good decisions. And so in that discussion that Grant and I have been having, so we're chatting about climate resilience in the Bay, and part of that, the infrastructure of the city is a key component. And Grant had some interesting views on some aspects of that. And so I've invited him to join us today, and then just to talk through the infrastructure in terms of really what were we thinking when we put that kind of infrastructure together. And the Settlers Highway is obviously one of the key factors for us as a city. So without much further ado, I'm going to introduce you to, well, I'm going to allow Grant to continue. The format is very simple, is that we go for about 30 minutes, the person presents, and then we open it up for questions and answers. We might push it to about 40 minutes, depends on, so Grant, don't feel under any pressure. And then we'll open it to question and answers. And we're fairly strict in terms of keeping it just down to an hour. So we'll finish at 3:30. So Grant, thank you very much for joining us and for being willing to sit in with a bunch of philosophers or wannabe philosophers, and add some practical value to us, in terms of developmental economics. Thank you, and over to you.
No, great. So thank you very much for the introduction, Gary. Yeah, so I'm going to just get ready to share my screen and get everything set up. So just make sure. Right. Okay, can you see the presentation? Wait, no. I'll just click on share. All right, you should be able to see the presentation on screen now. So yeah, like Gary says, I'm a development economist. So how I come into talking about things like, spatial development and things like the Settlers Freeway really comes from my interest in maybe looking further than the surface. A lot of economists like to look purely at the numbers and what's happening with industry, and what are the growth rates, and what are the incentives being offered for different industries, and how do we grow things from a very financial transactional sense. My interest often turns to things that are practical. I'm very intrigued by the way our cities are constructed, how they're built. I view economies as living organisms. They occupy space, they have various parts that interrelate with each other, and you can't really separate the form of a city from its function as an economic entity with various different role players from government and private sector and the residents of the city. So my interest really comes into sort of understanding like what happened to our CBD, how did it decay, and learning along the way as well in terms of seeing what's happened around the world in terms of other cities, how they've gone through similar problems, and being able to revitalize their urban cores through getting rid of their freeways in many cases. So yeah, I'll start off my presentation really by just presenting first a little view of what Port Elizabeth used to look like. And this first image, I think, is just really nice, just illustrating that our city used to be very connected to the sea, our city center. It used to be very accessible. Yes, there was a big port. Yes, there was a lot of industry that was built there. Along the seafront, there were commercial businesses, warehouses, various trading enterprises, but the city itself was connected to the sea. People could go up, they could go to the various fishing industries, you could even go right up to the docks and buy fish straight from a boat. There wasn't any hard barriers. And that's really important in terms of the emotional side of what it means to be living in a city, that you don't feel hemmed in. And the construction of the Settlers Freeway really did put up a very hard wall separating the city centre from the bay, which is one of the first things to consider when you look at the eventual decline of the CBD. Here we have a little view, it's all black and white photo from, I think it's from the 1950s. And then this just shows what the bay actually looked like. So here we have Jetty Street, which ran right through the city centre, past the Campanile, and out onto the main jetty. The main road went obviously through Main Street, ran along here, and all the way out. And then there was Strand Street, which ran along the foreshore along these railway lines. So it was very industrial, very commercial, but still the city was connected. And it was people were able to flow in and out of the city. And also remember at this time, until the 1970s, all of the major commerce, all retail really happened in the city centre. There was no Greenacres shopping centre, there was no Warmer Park shopping centre. There were shops around, but the main area where people did their business, they did their shopping, was all in the CBD. And if you look at just from the image here, you can see that it's a very open, the streets just crossing the area. It's very easy to access in and out, where at the moment now, it's actually very difficult to get into the CBD, and not very pleasant at all. So I thought I didn't know how many people were going to be in this presentation and what the different backgrounds were. I thought maybe there'd be some youngsters which really had no clue about what our CBD used to look like. I'm probably one of them, but I've got parents that always telling me about how things used to be and how they used to go shopping in the city centre. So I thought it would be nice just to show a few pictures of how vibrant our city centre used to be. I said it used to be the centre of commerce. It used to be a very exciting and vibrant place. That's the bottom of Russell Road before the freeway was constructed. Here we see it going up, nice open boulevard going all the way up into the City Hall. And here we can see some black and white images again from the 60s, I think, from the 50s and the 60s. And here, what I'd like us to note is just how open everything is. So here we can see that on the top right, there's the tramways going up. Most people don't realize that Elizabeth had a very vibrant tram system at one stage until the late 40s. There were parks, outside City Hall was a major park. So it was a very open and inviting place to be. And it was busy. There were a lot of cars and increasingly a lot of cars, which led to the next sort of decisions to shape the future for the city centre. So around the late 50s, the idea started to emerge that we need to address the traffic problems. And then in around 1963, the Settlers Freeway was finally constructed. Obviously, this took many, many years. But it was a result of, firstly, there was the burgeoning economy of what was then Port Elizabeth. Auto manufacturing was doing brilliantly. Many industries were booming, and as wealth levels were increasing, and especially the middle class was very prosperous and burgeoning at that stage. People wanted private automobiles, and traffic levels started to increase. And looking ahead, people started to get worried about what does the future look like for the city. The thinking at the time was guided mainly by American-centric planning policy. Especially post World War II, the United States in particular embarked on an expansive project to build freeways across the entire country. They built a network of interstates, and there was billions of dollars that were set aside for the building of freeways into each of the various cities and across the various city centres. Now, so we were no different. We were really following the lead. And the same was true for Europe, especially after the Second World War, through the Marshall Plan. billions of US dollars were filtered in, and the Americans primarily guided policy in terms of spatial development and what was going to be happening in these cities. So cities like the Netherlands, that were threatened by bombing during the war, those were all, just decisions were made in terms of, okay, well, let's just knock down all the old buildings. We're going to put down big wide boulevards. We're going to start, putting freeways down, and we're going to develop these modern cities that are going to be, vibrant and prosperous. And, we're going to get away from the old style of building cities, and we're going to look forward to this vibrant future. So it's not, it's just important for us to understand that where our thinking in terms of building these freeways comes from. It wasn't out of the blue. There was precedent, and our government at the time was embarking on this process of funding freeway development to also help our cities to follow the example of the Americans and the cities in Europe to build these modern cities where the individual mobility was the priority, and everyone should have a car, and everyone should be able to drive their car wherever they need to get to. And there was a certain mentality around this sort of A to Bism, where the idea at the time was that the most important thing for the rational consumer is to get from where they live to where they work and back. And all of the planning that followed really was built on that concept, a flawed concept, but that was the idea, was that the most important thing is to get from where you are to where you want to be as fast as possible. And that's what's going to maximize your utility. It's what's going to make you more productive, and it's what's going to lift your economies. And so there was no real regard for spaces, for having interactive spaces, places where different shared spaces, recreational spaces. That really wasn't a concern at the time. So just to show a view of what GM's future vision was. So at the 1939 World's Fair, GM presented their vision for the future. And here we can see that it was skyscrapers with lanes and lanes and lanes of highways and motorways. And this was the idea, is that successful economy is one where everyone starts to generate wealth. Everyone's going to have a massive car. You're going to have your Pontiac and your Buick and whatever you want, and you're going to be able to drive in luxury from the suburbs where you now live. Your bedroom house, and you're going to drive along this motorway into the city center where you can work in a nice modern office block. And that was the idea, and it was thought that everyone is going to want this, and this is the way of the future. And there was no real doubt at that stage that this is the way the world was going to go. Now, there are interesting parallels between what happened in the United States and also in other parts of the world and what happened in South Africa, in that the policy with regards to mobility and the development of the freeway systems was very closely tied to policies of racial segregation, of separation of classes, and it's no different in the United States really than it was in South Africa. So we had cities like we have here at Hastings Street in Detroit, a vibrant community, a multicultural mix of different classes, very unique cultural identities in cities like this. And these were completely torn apart to lay down freeways. So the idea was that, no, this is progress, it's going to make everything a lot better. But there was also this undertone of, this gives us an opportunity to get rid of those communities that we didn't really think part of our vision of the future, and we can make space for new development, and we can shift those lower class, either in America's case was into the urban core, into ghettos and planned housing estates, or shifting people out into the urban edge. So you have So not only is a lot of communities were completely destroyed, but also these freeway developments create massive divides. It's basically a canyon. So the community on one side really becomes split off from the community on the other side, and that tears the fabric of these communities apart. And it's something that can be observed in South Africa as well. So this brings me on to South End. So like we've seen in the United States example, the same thing really was true for South End's development. So we have our freeway development, which is happening in the early 60s. At the same time, we have the evictions from South End. And reading up on the clearance of South End in the last week has really yeah, it really shocked me again, although I've read it before, just to read the language that was being used at that time. For anyone that is familiar with South End, you'll know it as a very vibrant, multicultural, community. And to see the language that was being used to describe those communities is really sickening still to this day. So the motivation really was to get rid of these slums, as they were calling them, and prepare for the future. And part of that was to build this freeway system. So the clearing of South End allowed for the development of housing for more affluent white residents, and also for the development of this freeway system. Because initially the idea was not only to build the Settlers Freeway system as we understand it now, but also to build a freeway that goes right up the Barkens Valley. And thankfully, due to environmental lobbyist groups, that was eventually put on hold, but the rest of the freeway system was still developed. So this is that same view. So this is South Union Street, and this is used to be here is South Union Street today, with the freeway just right on top of it, and all of those houses, everything was destroyed, and it's really very harsh, a harsh addition to the urban landscape. So one thing to consider before I carry on is just I've introduced this concept of tearing down the freeway, but it's nice to think about, well, where's this been done before? I remember when I was young in the 90s, it was an idea by the municipality that was then under the leadership of Mayor Faku to tear down the freeways, and I think there was even talk of building a canal network at one stage. At the time, it was incredibly far-fetched, and people thought, this could never happen. It's expensive. How can you get rid of the freeways? It's going to cause chaos. And very little was ever heard of that project again. So perhaps, yeah, that project was maybe a bit ahead of its time. But where have these projects actually been successful? So on the picture here is in Seattle, the Alaskan Way. This was a major highway that was built along the coast, very similar to what we see in Nelson Mandela Bay today. It divided the city center from the various keys along the coast, and where a lot of fishing and industry happens, and it presented this very hard barrier, which meant that the city center had very little to do with the coastal waterway. And if you look at that today, it's been completely taken away. So it took a lot of time. It was a lot of pushback against this project, and I think all of these projects that I'm going to show you now, but eventually, with consistent pressure and a very clear vision of what the future was going to be, they were able to successfully demolish that freeway system. In this case, they built I think they built a tunnel as well to assist this, but they took the surface road down to 2 lanes, and they are continuing to redevelop that seafront now, making more space for additional building developments, new public spaces, enhanced public transport. So yeah, it's quite a shocking difference from this hard barrier to the city to now creating a lot more open space and allowing the city to connect to the sea once again. San Francisco is a very nice example as well. Um, if you're interested in this topic, I'd really recommend you reading about the San Francisco freeway system and their community's action to halt freeway development in their city over the years. It's a very interesting example. But one of the freeways that was constructed was the Embarcadero Freeway, multi-level freeway, very hard barrier separating the city center from the waterfront. It's very reminiscent of the Settlers Freeway here, which separates our city center from the harbor. Here's some examples. On the left here, we can see the old ferry building with the Embarcadero Freeway in front of it, and now today, with it completely removed, a much more inviting space. Here on the top right as well, we can see the very imposing multi-level freeway, and now with it being removed. Now, interestingly here is that they managed to remove their freeway, but they didn't replace it with a tunnel. There was no bypass that was created. They were able to accommodate the traffic that was necessary by just providing basic road surface level roads, but then using public transport, various forms of public transport, encouraging cycling, and various other policies to reduce the level of car traffic, which is essential for projects such as these, and which is an example has been followed by many cities now going into the future. And here we have the ferry building now today, very far removed from what it used to look like. So even in Europe, missteps were made. So again, I said post Second World War, the idea was that the modern way of doing things must prevail. So those parts of cities that were flattened by bombing during the war were sort of cleaned up, and new freeway systems were built. So yeah, in the city of Utrecht, which is now one of the cycling capitals of the world, back in the 1950s, this freeway system was built. 1973 was the last time when the roads were actually expanded. And yeah, very imposing, not a very inviting place, not a place that promotes walkability or cycling or any interest in shopping or retail environment. It's not a very inviting place to do business at all. And this is what it looks like today. And I think that's a very like stark example. So they went from a complete urban hellscape into this green wonderland where the city doesn't cease to function. In fact, the city is doing better now than it ever has before. And this wasn't just a random side street. This was one of the main streets in the city of Utrecht. And they managed to uncover this old canal, develop urban parkways, and there are still roads that run through this area, single or double lane roads. But there's a lot of public transport options, and there's a lot of provision for urban cycling and also for walkability. So through providing for other means of transport, they disincentivize driving and their city to not just carry on functioning, but actually to grow. Back to America, we have Boston, the Central Artery Highway. Following the modern ideas of the 1950s was to just ram a freeway right through the center of the city. And this is what it looks like today. Urban parkways, there's still some surface level roads. There's a tunnel development to carry the bulk of traffic through the center of town. But essentially, they've been able to hand the city back to the residents and not have the motor car being citizen number one. Montreal in Canada, the Bonaventure Expressway, also got rid of their freeway. No tunnel development. This is just taking away the freeways, putting down surface level roads, and making sure that there's public transport, that there's provision for urban cycling, and they've actually massively reduced the rate of driving in the city. just because they've provided other options for people to get around. So it can be done in other places. Can it be done in Nelson Mandela Bay? I mean, that's the real big question. And one of the first things that comes to mind is, well, what's it going to cost? You spent how many millions in the 60s building these freeways. How can you tell me now that we're going to tear them down? I mean, that's a massive waste of money. I always think of a quote, and I think it's by Michael Colville Anderson. He's a very well-known urbanist who says, don't hold on to your mistakes just because you took a long time in making them. So yes, freeways are expensive to build, but if they don't make sense, they really do need to go. And we can't cling on to outdated infrastructure just because we spent a lot of money putting it in the first place. But there are other ways of approaching the idea of cost. So firstly, what I'd like us to think about is, what is the cost of leaving the CBD is at the moment? And what is the benefit? So in terms of costs, you also talk about benefits. What is the benefit of revitalizing the urban center? It doesn't take away the cost. So although we have to think about funding, and our municipalities do have limited budgets, looking at this from a long-term perspective, we need to think, what is this going to be if we don't do it? Another thing to consider is that freeways have limited lifespans. We need to resurface them, I think, every 10 years. We should be doing it. And eventually those freeways do need to be torn down and rebuilt again. So it's eventually it's going to happen that those freeways need to be those freeways are constantly maintained. They constantly suck up money. So it's another way of looking at it as well, that those freeways need to come down at some point in any case. I see I'm running out of time, so I just want to do a quick view just to help everyone understand. So here we have let me just change screen quick. Apologies. I'm just trying to see how I can change my screen. Great. Okay, so here I've got Google Earth, and we can see the CBD as it is right now. And if I just zoom in, sorry, can you all see my screen? Okay, great. So if we look at the CBD as it is now, we can highlight the existing city center. So really, it's quite narrow space. Runs really along the city. We've got a very long and narrow city, and there's really not much space to do anything. And here along the side, we can see the Settlers Freeway, big raised freeway. Underneath is the remnants of Strand Street that's been really taken over by the taxi industry in the last few decades. And we all understand what it feels like in that area. If you are familiar with that part of town, it's very dark, very dingy. It feels dangerous, and oftentimes it is quite dangerous. And here we have this hard barrier that is presented, cutting off our city centre from the coast. So if we can imagine what the city now would look like with an urban, with surface level roadway, allows the city really to reconnect. But another thing I want to just draw attention to as we're thinking about ideas is looking at the port itself. So yes, we can tear this freeway down, but if we look at the port, we have these rail lines that come through, and all of these rail lines go through to the manganese terminal. Those are eventually going to disappear as the manganese terminal eventually gets relocated, and we can make space for our waterfront development. We've got rail lines which come onto the old fresh produce terminal, which to my knowledge aren't being used at the moment. It's all being trucked in. So the only real necessary rail line is really on the edge. So we have all this dead space. Now, what I'd like to propose for somebody that has the power to think along these lines is to start envisioning a city where we think about how much space can be reclaimed. Now, if you start to think about taking the freeway away and creating space for a new city to be developed, there's a lot of extra space which is currently not being used and is really waiting for development to happen. So this is something that I'd just like to add to help us to get excited about what the future based CBD could look like. So yes, this takes away from the Portnet or Transnet properties, and we all know how hard it is to fight them. But I think it's a fight that's worthwhile to happen. If you look at the Transnet vision for the future, we can see that eventually their long-term plan is to expand. This is their vision 2047, their long-term vision. It's going to be quite a long way beyond that, but their long-term plans are already looking at expanding the port. So why not give us the space back to allow us to revitalize our city centre? And then, of course, if we zoom out, we have the eventual waterfront development, which will eventually take place along the south. So yeah, let me just stop sharing that. And I'm just going to rush through the last few slides, and I know I'm taking up too much time here. So yeah, the question about the traffic situation, I think that's core to really what it'll take to tear down this freeway, and that's just to think about how our thinking about mobility has changed over the last decade or last century. 100 years ago, cars were just being invented, and there were new entrants into our city. And our cities were still designed to really prioritize the individual, the human being. There was space that was being provided for cycling. Cyclists can go very slowly; they can go to human place. There was tram networks, and some public transport was to come into our cities. Automobiles were, these new visitors. And it was only really since the 1950s. So it's only been 70 years where our thinking has shifted to prioritizing car-based urban mobility and to make cars citizen number one. So it's just something to think about, that it might feel like this is the way it's always been, but it really hasn't. There really isn't a reason for us to design the cities around cars. Cities can function, and they are being shown to function perfectly fine once you start removing cars from the roads and giving options for getting around their cities. Just want to skip past that. So the last things I want to say is, what will it take? So as far as I see it, what it'll take to tear down these freeways and to revitalize our cities. So firstly, it's going to take courageous, clear, and stable leadership. That's going to someone to hold the wheel for a number of years to keep driving this forward. It's not something that can be, shifted around, every 2 or 3 years and new people taking up the helm of a project like this. It needs clear visions and stability. It's going to take a big picture view of the city as a living organism. Like I say, it can't just be viewed as a one-off project. It has to be considered as a project that fits within the context. It will require very strong and vocal community support. It's going to require a change of mindset from car dependence to more sustainable mobility. And it's going to require the buy-in and collaboration across multiple spheres of government. So especially if you look at Transnet, if we are going to look at ways of expanding our CBD's footprint. So yeah, that's just lastly, there are additional resources I'd like to make you aware of. They are in the presentation here, but I'll share the presentation also to those that are here with links to various videos and YouTube channels and maybe some other written resources if you want to learn more about this and other related topics. And yeah, I think that's where I'll end off, and I'll I could talk on for hours on this type of topic, so yeah, excuse me if I've overrun, but I'll be really grateful to receive your comments and carry on the discussion. Thank you.
Grant, awesome. Thank you very much. If you'll just stop screen share, and then let's take, so before we go into questions, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. The first one is this idea of it somewhere along the line, our cities went from designed for people to designed for cars, which is associated with this idea of everyone should own a car. And I was particularly intrigued by GM's vision of how cities should be working. I mean, I think that's quite revealing. And then in terms of just our own city, how we broke down Southend, I mean, it is a terribly tragic story. But Southend at the moment would appear to be less dense than it was in the 60s and 70s. So it seemed to be more efficient, more people living there than people are living there today. So we've almost gone backwards in terms of urban planning in that sense. And then in terms of just the solutions, what comes through clearly is that policy is a key leverage, is that your local government has to, or your national government, whoever, but government has to implement a policy. And that it's often accompanied by greening, often accompanied by urban public transport, so the availability of it, by cycling, and by tunnels. So not always tunnels, but sometimes tunnels. And then there was a key point about rethinking costs, in the sense that you needed to look beyond just how much you're going to pay for it, but actually what the benefits of this are. And the ultimate question is obviously, is in a city, how do you use space? And that, and where is your priority? Is it around people? Is it around cars? So that was fascinating. Thank you very much for that, Grant. I'm going to open the floor to any questions. Any questions from anyone? Just show your hand, either by the emoji or physically just raise your hand, and I'll allow you opportunity. And if we don't have that, Grant, maybe just whilst people think through, could you perhaps just chat about that transition from human to cars? What were we thinking there? What was that?
So, yeah, what really happened around the late 40s into the early 50s was the growth in the power of the vehicle lobby. So we had these massive companies in America building these cars. And of course, those were allied to the companies in the steel industries and into the rubber industries making the tires. So there were a whole bunch of industries that were allied into, looking after each other. And of course, the way it works in America is you start paying senators and you start promoting your own agenda. And indeed, it was necessary at the time. America was very disorganized, and so the development of the interstate system was very important in terms of connecting east to west, to allow America to function properly. But what happened is that they developed a policy where individual cities paid 1%. They paid $1 for freeway development, and the federal government would pay $9. So there was this massive incentivizing of developing of freeways, and it really there were a lot of architects and philosophers at that stage painting this vision for what the future was. Of course, we had come out of the Great Depression, and we were coming out of a major world war. So there was this idea that we need to look forward into the future, and this vision of these big glistening cities where everyone's going to work in these skyscrapers and the Jetsons. This was the idea of what the future would be. I wanted to add on to that other point you made about cities being designed for people. So historically, yes, cities were always designed for people, and just something to add into the mix about how we design our cities. If you had to look at our city right now, you would think from just looking at a satellite image that we've designed our cities for cars and for car owners. The latest census stats show that 71% of households in Nelson Mandela Bay don't own a car. So that's 71% of households that rely exclusively on public transport. And if you consider there are households as well that will own cars, but also primarily make use of public transport. It starts to paint this really interesting picture about, who exactly are we building our city for? And would it actually not be more just to start investing in public transport and in non-motorized transport and in walkable, spaces? Would that actually not be a much better way of designing a city rather than facilitating the transit of, middle and upper income households from the suburbs on the outskirts of town through our city and into wherever they need to be via freeways? So that's just something else to consider.
Awesome. Thanks, Grant. Helen, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I don't know why, but I'm getting to the state whenever somebody talks about a vision of the future, I just get really, really scared. And sorry, Zoom is saying something to me. They're going to lower my hand in 1 second. There, my hand's been lowered. Wow. So how could you rather, and I raised this, I think, last time with Andrea, how do we stop having visions of the future? Because we're really, really bad at predicting the future and unintended consequences and all of this business. How is it possible, feasible, helpful to think about not having a vision of the future, but a vision of like what's actually going on now? And I can hear that that's part of this, but how do you not get sucked into the dream? Because it's just really scary.
Yeah, I think so. I always say that the one thing that we spend a lot of time in planning and sort of economics and thinking about what is the worst that could happen. And one of the things that people often forget is to plan for success. So I always say that, we need to think about what are the consequences of our success. So I think we do need to think about the way we plan and the way we create rhythms and thinking a bit beyond just a fly in the sky sort of idea about where we want to go, but what does it actually mean? So I think firstly, we need to become a lot better at how we describe our visions and explore what that vision really means. So make sure that we actually understand what we're asking for. Secondly, in the modern sense, there's a lot of systems to collect data about our cities so that cities can make informed decisions. If you look at a lot of European cities now, there are data collection points across the city. You would be shocked to know how many points there are where they're collecting traffic data on how many people are walking down the street, cycling down the street, and that allows these cities to make really intuitive and evidence-based answers to questions. So they're allowed to react to things as they see them, and make micro adjustments really, rather than creating these big grand visions for where they want to go. So I think looking forward into the future, I think we need to become smarter about how we monitor what's happening in our cities so we can change things on the fly. But we do have a lot of major problems, and those will require some, big picture thinking in terms of how we address them. A lot of those in our city comes down to safety and security, some very practical things that need to be addressed. Yeah, but I think just another point just to add is about creating these visions. So one of the things that often comes out is especially recently, this idea of a smart city, and this amazing, again, we're going back to thinking of this shining example of what the future would be. I am more a proponent of dumb cities. So I want our city to be dumb, and what I mean by dumb is that if you think about getting from point A to B, at the moment, people are, proposing usage of apps and driverless cars, that if you walk out your door, there's a car that meets you and then you can just get in, it takes you where you want to be. I think a city is far better where there is a robust public transport system, where a bus comes every 5 minutes and you know exactly where to be. And as a citizen, you have to think as little as possible. So I think we should get away from thinking about how to integrate all this technology and live with a smartphone or a microchip in the brains, and rather think about how we can design our cities in practical ways, so that us as human beings can interact with it in a very natural way. Sorry, I see there's a hand up.
Yeah. Glenn, you want to go ahead? Thanks, Grant.
Thank you so much, Grant, for a very fascinating talk. I have a very simple question, really, which is about that example that you gave about the area on the foreshore which could potentially be developed, that you said we should reclaim from Transnet, and what type of development you see happening there, if you could talk us through that. And then my other important question was, how does weather play into this, and how that land could be developed and used? Because I'm thinking that being on the coast and so near to the water, and given the fact that Port Elizabeth is a very windy city, and other coastal cities have got this phenomenon, whether that influences why people design things in a particular way, or decide not to use it for recreation purposes or commercial purposes, because it's just so damn unpleasant. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thanks. I'm going to listen with my camera off.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Glenn.
so firstly, the use of that space, that's going to be a big challenge, but I think it's something that the city needs to decide that it's something that they definitely want to pursue. It's going to have to be a big fight with Transnet to get hold of that land. I hope it's something that can be picked up in future, because that land is severely underutilized. It could be used for a variety of purposes. We could develop new housing there, hopefully medium to high density housing. It could be new office blocks. So depending on how we are able to clean up the city, with the demolishing of the freeway, building new roadways and surface level streets, there will need to be sort of inviting in of the private sector to also be part of imagining what purposes they could be used for the city. But that needs to be a whole separate process and discussion. I think that needs to be done in consultation with the residents of the city to imagine what that region should best be used for. But I think it's better to look at that area for redevelopment than to try and imagine building a new city on the outskirts of town, which is what's happening in a number of cities around the world, where cities are giving up on their urban cores and they're building new CBDs somewhere else. And that really doesn't solve any problems. It just makes the problems worse. And it's that's what was proposed for Durban as well, with the development of their new smart city. It really sounds amazing, but it really was just a sign of the city giving up on the CBD. But as for the weather question, that's something that would need to be studied. There are systems available now which allow us to answer questions like that. So, for example, in Singapore, what they have is a system where if you want to build a new development, they have a very detailed model that accounts for the weather, and they can actually model how your new development is going to impact wind flow and other properties, if it's going to create in welcome environment at street level, if it's going to increase temperatures, because obviously it's a very humid environment there. So these systems exist that can help us to design our cities. And of course, being close to the shore, you can worry about sea level rise and that, but that ground is actually quite high above sea level, it's quite a few meters above. And of course, when it comes to construction, that can be factored in.
Grant, thanks for that. Glenn, thanks for the question. Grant, I just wanted to pick up on a point there, is that the land that you've identified is Transnet land, which is a national entity. So the city actually doesn't own that land. And maybe you just want to comment on the thinking around that, and whether that helps us as a city or doesn't help us or hinders us as a city, in the sense that you have a state-owned enterprise that's headquartered somewhere else, whose priority is Durban, not our bay, and so you have a derelict train station. It's about to collapse, and whether they'd actually have enough energy to think about what you're proposing.
Well, You would think that it makes it easier because it's one entity to speak to and to come to an agreement with. But history tells us that, you know, negotiating with Transnet is anything but easy, and it just drags on for years and years and years. But the one thing that's been missing, I think, in our engagements with Transnet over the years has been strong and stable leadership, and leadership that is willing to go into battle with the likes of Transnet. And if you look at other examples around the world where there has been major development, it's only occurred where there has been very strong leadership, and leadership that's prepared to not please everyone and to, you know, ruffle a few feathers and to fight what they believe in. If you look, I mean, it's part of our city. So although it's owned by Transnet, it is part of our city, and we need to have that in as part of our mindset. And it's, as a city, we need to have a vision about how we want to utilize that land. And that needs to be something we need to pursue year after year until we get it right. And it will take a very strong leadership to help make that happen. And unfortunately, over the last many years, it's usually been the case that leadership will rather shy away from fights and rather pay attention to areas where it's a lot more easy to make progress.
If I could just continue on Helen's point earlier, this thing of the vision, and to link it to your picture of GM's vision of cities of the future. You know, so Helen's response is that creates quite a bit of tension for her, in the sense that it's very scary in terms of if GM actually had their wish, what our cities would now be functioning like if they go on red. So I mean, you're arguing that there's strong leadership that is required, that is visionary leadership, that is willing to fight for what they believe in. The question in my mind is how does that leadership know that their vision is the right vision? You know, so if we were led in the 1950s by a GM type person, would have had a freeway up the Barkans Valley, you know? So what's the test of the sustainability of a vision, put it that way?
Yeah. Well, I think you just go back to the leadership part of it. So firstly, leadership in the modern sense needs to be priority. We need to walk the road with the community to make sure the community is informed and part of the process. So I think that's definitely something that needs to be part of the strong leadership dynamic. Another thing is that it needs to be evidence-based. So if you go back into the past, you know, from the 1950s, all of these developments were based on an idea of what the future should be, but it wasn't actually evidence-based. If you look at the modern ways of planning cities, and it's happening in Paris over the last few years. Paris has turned itself around thanks to very strong leadership. You know, a lot of, especially the Dutch cities, all of their decisions are evidence-based. And what they've found is that if you de-incentivize motor traffic, and you incentivize public transport, if you create spaces that are that are more walkable, that it actually has major economic benefits and social benefits. So I think it's a big part of it is actually looking at the data and making sure we understand what we're doing our homework, making sure that there are studies that back everything up, making sure that those studies go out for you know, community consultation, so that everybody can actually agree on what those outcomes are.
Awesome, thanks, Grant. You know, so I mean, a point that comes through. You were talking about the freeway development in the States, where the local authority paid $1 and the national paid $9. And so, you know, I mean, the same point about our auto industry. Without incentives, we wouldn't have an auto industry based in the city. And often I think that that's something that's missed in the picture, is it's not under the table, but sort of background incentives that are offered by the various levels of the state to drive certain things, which is, I mean, are there incentives at the moment offered by the state in terms of particular developmental, city, urban developmental priorities? Do you know what that is?
Well, the biggest incentives are the ones which actually don't exist on paper, not obviously in any case. it's pseudo incentives. So, for instance, our planning restrictions. So, if you want to build a new commercial development, your requirements for parking, things like this are all actually incentives that promote a form of land use which promotes individual car ownership. So it's actually, like, if you try and develop in city centre in Nelson Mandela Bay, you probably need to be able to get that past planning permission, because buildings are too close together. There's not enough parking. It just wouldn't work. So it's all of these soft sort of policies which need to be looked at. And then again, there's the issue of induced demand. So our current traffic engineering, the way they function is that, well, if traffic levels reach a certain amount, we just build more roads. We add an extra lane in. And what that actually does is incentivize people to buy more cars. So it's a documented and studied phenomenon of this issue of induced demand. That the more roads you build, the more cars fill those roads. So it's something that wasn't understood until the 90s, really. Although there were some components that understood it from the beginning, it didn't really catch on until the late 90s, where people started to understand that the more roads you build, the more cars you get. So there's, beyond what incentives there might be on the local government level for various types of initiatives, and they're not really that many, most of our incentives are actually within our planning policies.
Awesome. Grant, again, thank you very much for taking out the time to come join us and talk to us about what we were thinking in the 50s and 60s and 70s building this freeway. I was fascinated to see that we started that freeway before I was born, and it's still around. Not to say that I've been around for that long, but yeah, I mean, it in the 60s they made decisions that impact us now 60 years later, and that's a fundamental thing to think about, is that the decisions we're taking today will be with us 60 to 80 to 100 years later, and we create problems for generations ahead of us. So what are we thinking today, I think, is one of the key questions in terms of how we go forward. So thank you for your participation. Thanks to everyone else. I'm going to hand back over to Andrea, who will just close off the session for us. Grant, once again, thanks very much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Grant. It was fascinating. Of course, we're all watching with riveted eyes on all these pictures of our city. It was really fascinating to look at, and also intensely frustrating, I think. There's this sense of okay, to think differently will be to be different, and we're trying to, in some senses, think differently. And what you've raised and shown us, I think, is how absolutely difficult it would be to be different. It almost seems like a monumental task to actually put into practice a different way of thinking about humanity, and thinking, instead of thinking of us in terms of cars and moving from, what did you say, where you live to where you work, and instead being in the city and being human in the city. One can think about that and dream about it, but to actually make it happen is intensely frustratingly difficult. So yeah, I think, it makes sense what Gary was saying, that you actually need to be quite careful about what you think, because you'll put into place something that's going to live with us for an awfully long time. So thank you. It was fascinating. It really was very interesting. I wish we could chat on forever, but I'm very glad that you've got all these images that we can now look at again on YouTube. Next week we will shift to something quite actually connected. It'll be Werner Smith who's going to be talking about radical conversion. I don't know what it will involve, but it also has to do with this idea of if you think different, you can be different, but flippin' hell, it's so hard to put it into practice. But it can be done. That was wonderful. I mean, those pictures of cities that do actually change from harsh, hard sharp lines to interconnected kind of areas were very inspiring. I just really hope that we'll be able to do it at some point. But thank you very much for
Thanks, Andrea. If I could just add one last thing. It will be difficult to change, but I firmly believe that if a modern sustainable city is built on sustainable urban development values, if it can happen anywhere in South Africa, I think it's happened in Nelson Mandela Bay. It's far easier to implement projects like this than in Cape Town or in Johannesburg. And the curse in the lack of development over the last 20 or 30 years is actually in many ways our blessing, because we have room and we have the options to actually make some changes. And I think that's very exciting, and hopefully will unlock a lot of potential for us in the future. But thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Let's end on that note. Okay, thanks so much. Okay.
Bye-bye.